Hello and welcome back to another episode of Control Alt Teach. I'm going to go bold this time. I'm going to say a number. I think this is episode 9. We normally don't say a number, but I'm going to say 9 this time.
I was going to
so
say
it looks
7.
like we know what we're doing. 7. I think it's
We're all over
9 because we have an apology on our, I'm going to say previous episode, because we are definitely going to post it before this one. So again, we'll apologise again to poor Tom Rogerson, who's been in the chamber for a couple of months now.
He's been waiting since Christmas. It was Panto season when we recorded it.
Yeah, hopefully he's forgiven us by now. But yes, we are back. It's a new term for a lot of us. We're just filming this at the start of April. So into the Easter term, I am 1 week away from baby being here, and we'll see how many episodes we can cram in before then. Matt, how have you been? You're back in.
I'm good. First day back at work today, so obviously didn't sleep properly last night. You know how it goes. And then just busy first day. My students are on study leave, but just messaging me constantly, or like turning up at my classroom door with scribbled past papers asking questions. But yeah, it's been like boots on the ground, back to business as usual. Like you always think it's going to be a bit of a relief, and then it just ends up, you just end up getting bombarded no matter what, don't you, in a school?
Yeah, we're in this crazy term. I'm going to say this for prosperity, but we've got 4 weeks. Literally a 4-week term. I've gone from a 7-weeker into a 4-weeker. So I'm looking forward to just 2 rotations and then we're done, and then back on holiday again. So it's a weird one coming into sort of the GCSE stretch this year. But fingers crossed, we've done a lot of the prep work in the previous term. And then hopefully my 3D design students will be much better suited, ready for when we come to the exam. So which we're pretty much done with already. We've done the first day. We got one more day afterwards with the year 11s at the moment. So yeah, hopefully they're going to be doing fine, and the year 10s are looking great, looking on form. So we're doing well. But we've got a superb guest this week, someone we've been trying to have on the pod for a long time, and is one of my heroes, someone who really got me into EdTech and was the first book I bought on EdTech as well. But I'll let you do the intro, Matt.
Yeah, no pressure. Al Kingsley, MBE, and we'll come on to that a little bit later in the intro. He's the CEO of NetSupport, which is a global EdTech company. I believe over 18 million users. That's what the internet told me, including ourselves as our school. 35 plus years in EdTech, chairs multi-academy trusts, send boards, sits on a DFE advisory panel. We're here to just chat to Al in general, but also about his upcoming book, Awkward Questions in Education. And he's just known for giving that kind of many hats perspective, part EdTech innovator, involved in governance, respected speaker, writer, strategist, MBE for services to education. And we're just here to talk a little bit about everything, but maybe some little awkward questions, some awkward truths about education.
Goodness, what an introduction. Thank you, folks. It is a pleasure to be here. And it's always nice to hear people that at some point encountered my first book, my Secret EdTech Diary. I'm glad you found it interesting. It was a bit of a learning journey for me too. People say practice makes perfect. I'm still at the practice stage, but I have aspirations for perfect one day.
Well, it's a new edition, and I hope you've put all that practice into it, which I'm hopefully going to get my hands on very soon. It's going to be winging its way to me shortly. But yeah, that first book for me personally really got my head. I tell you what it did actually do. No, it didn't get my head around it, because I was expecting a framework. I was expecting a do this, do that, do that. Whereas actually it opened my eyes to the world of EdTech. There was no answers to it. It was a case of inter-reflection and to look at your school, look at what your problems were, and then go from there. And I think that's what a lot of people struggle with, and they maybe look for definitive answers but then don't necessarily get.
It's an interesting one, isn't it? I've always been of the belief that certainly when it comes to within the education space and digital, whether it's looking at your broader digital aspirations, your vision, and increasingly on my DFE role, it's just broader leadership and expansion of school systems. the right approach is to give people the questions to ask, not the answers, because there's so much nuance, there's such different pace of change. We all have that conversation around, well, it all depends on the cohort of children I've got within 1 year when we're looking at our outcomes and progress. But actually, in this context, it's the cohort of all your students and just as much the cohort of your staff. And then it's also about your budget and what you've got as your starting point. And so this idea of be prescriptive, I think is quite disrespectful to the professional in front of the class, frankly, to say this is how you should adopt this and this is when you should do it. Many, many moons ago, I went through, like many do, in the other way around. I get lots of educators reach out to me now trying to get a foot into the EdTech space or want advice on the next steps. And in the early days, I had the other way around, a little bit of that kind of imposter syndrome of, well, you're not a classroom teacher, so how dare you have an opinion on the effective use of educational technology? And as the years have gone on the different roles I've done, I get to a point now where I think, nobody can claim to have all the right answers. This is very much about a co-produced approach to education. It's about recognizing the differences and celebrating the different perspectives. I do like to use very clumsy and rather poor analogies at times. So in this context, I always like to use an F1 racing team. If anyone believes that the best way to improve the car for next year and the Formula One calendar is to have just the drivers design and build it, or just the engineers design and build it, then they'll recognize that actually it's the combination of the two perspectives and the two roles that are likely to get you faster around the track.
That is a great point, and actually it's something I learned with my business partner Ben, who being an engineer, and the lessons he has from industry. When we first started working together, it was really easy to say that aspect of, well, you don't really know the classroom, you don't know that, and to maybe dismiss some of those ideas quite quickly without actually going, well, no, you're coming at it from a very different point of view, and you're seeing something that I had just blanked over completely within a structure of the school, of this is the way things are. And I found myself saying that without realising it. And it's a phrase that we both hate saying of, oh, well, that's just the way things are. So having that different perspective, and I really like that F1 analogy you started there. But I stole Matt's thunder.
Yeah. I'm going to get talking about that and having those different perspectives. And you're saying, being from outside education, peering into education, obviously quite embedded and involved in the world of education now. You've worn many hats over the years. EdTech CEO, school governor, policy advisor, advising the DFE, MBE. If you had to pick one of those to describe yourself at a dinner party, which one and why?
I suppose if I was being really clumsy, and to be fair, I'm not very good with labels, I kind of think of myself as edu first, tech second. And that might seem strange, being 30 years EdTech CEO and so on. But, the last 20 plus years, I started in school governance, chair of a multi-academy trust with a school of one. We bid and we built 3 schools, and we've been through the whole design and implementation and build. We've gone through presumptive bids and we've built primary schools. I've stepped into an infant school that's just had a pretty catastrophe for offset inspection. Joined it with a view to be there for 3 months to support it, ended up being there 4 years, and then bringing them as part of our trust, being asked to join a pupil referral unit that just had a really bad offset inspection and some significant safeguarding concerns. Stayed there for the term intended to help steer the ship, ended up being there for 2 years, found them a home in a new multi-academy trust, got asked by the Department for Education to go and support a cluster of schools in Norfolk, in the east of England, that were not sustainable on the basis they were small rural village schools anchored by a specialist provision. No Matt in their right mind would want them. Having to find a recipe and a formula to preserve those schools because they're heart of the community and it's not just about the numbers, and successfully find it. For me, those are kind of the bits that really resonate and are important to me, and why I now sit. And people might say, who are you to be doing that, Al? I chair our regional Ascend board, have done for many years and done a number of regions. And I always start the conversation with, I'm probably the least qualified of all the experts in the room, but I also probably have the broadest knowledge of all the folks in the room, and I know the questions to ask. You know the answers. Let's bring it together. And I think sometimes we forget in education, in our attempts to be quite protective of the value of our profession and the things that we specialize on, that actually, there's much more in being more open to that idea of mindset. Exactly as I've alluded to, the number of educators who say, well, I want to step a little bit away from education to EdTech, but I've got this imposter syndrome. What can I offer? And the answer is loads. There's so much people learn in education that is transferable to the workplace. The number one thing is the reflective practice that I see from educators. If many more people in the corporate space could learn to be that mindset and that approach, but also the co-production, the way that we engage. And we just need to prevent this idea that just because you fit in one box, that's the way you are. I mean, somebody who's an amazing teacher probably ends up being an assistant head, a deputy head, and a head teacher. Half the role of a head teacher is not something you train for in a manual at any point. You know, you don't get lessons on HR and finance and those things, yet we think, well, based on promotion, you're good enough for the job. Move it up another scale and you get CEOs of school clusters, whether they're independent schools, school districts, multi-academy trusts in England. And the roles there are no different operationally to the CEO of a company. It's about managing resource. It just so happens that your product and output is just a way more precious than nuts and bolts or manufacturing. These are things that are fundamental to what we value most. But let's not pretend that anything that's knowledge-based is in the exclusive domain of any one person. We all learn by our experiences. You know, I would say I've sat in more management and leadership meetings of different schools across the region in the last 20 years than most people who are paid to do it. I just do it voluntarily. And, you know, but it doesn't mean that I don't assimilate, I don't take those ideas, and I don't feed ideas back in the other way.
Amazing. No, but that's great, because I think that's one of the, something you just said struck me is kind of when you do your PGCSE, become a teacher and start moving up, you kind of suddenly move out of the classroom into more management, and you don't really get much management training, and you don't really get much like HR training. You just kind of figure it out as a teacher, and I think it does broaden your skill set out a lot wider than probably you would think. And I think there is a lot more transferable skills. And people Absolutely. You talked about who've moved out of the classroom into the EdTech space. And you're talking about Ben as well. Just those outside voices as well, and those outside perspectives, because you can get a bit siloed in your own thinking and your own school community, because everything's unique to yourself. But I think it's good that people are there like needling and pushing. And as your book is asking awkward questions as well, I think there's a place for that.
We're all guilty of being a little bit in an echo chamber. And I think if you have your own personal development pathways, you always want to be looking to think about not the things that you absolutely agree with, but the things that you either disagree with or you don't understand. And I think that's why it's really, really important to have a broader community, have different sources of CPD. What I've certainly seen over the last 30 years is time on the hands of educators has diminished. And so if you have less time, you have less chance to research and learn. And so it puts more onus on the individual to find their own ways to develop. And so you're either left in a silo of your critical friend is YouTube, and that's all you get to watch. And based on algorithms, you'll find the same stuff keeps appearing time and time again. Or you push yourself to have the conversations with people that don't immediately align with you. And why don't they align with you? What's different? And sometimes it's misunderstanding a language. Sometimes it's actually that they've got a different perception and neither of you are right nor wrong. Sometimes it's regional nuance. And sometimes, and I hold my hands up quite often, I will have a conversation with someone and you think, you know what, you've opened my eyes to a different perspective. But I've also spent a lot of time going into clusters of schools, sitting down with leadership and sharing some insights. And at the end of it, they will say, I've never seen it that way before. I never thought of it that way. That unlocks my ability to use my own professional skills now to go what I need to do next. I haven't given anybody a magic bullet. I've just simply said, look at it from a different angle. And, you know, sometimes when we have our hardest problems, we go home and we sit down to our nearest and dearest and we explain it. And then explaining it, we figure it out. And it's part of that, having an opportunity just to reflect and process on something often takes you one step closer to a solution.
Yeah, because I always like use the analogy of like the show House, which I love. Just like that, just talking a problem through with somebody, even if like because I'm a computer scientist, we have like little rubber ducks, or like you have a mascot on your desk when you're programming. If you get stuck on your code, you talk to the rubber duck. So I give all my kids a rubber duck when they start doing IGCSE computer science, and if they get stuck in their code, they talk to the rubber duck. Now they talk to an AI bot, which is a more advanced rubber duck. But yeah, there's just something there to talk a problem through, or just push you in a different direction. My next question is about your early days with EdTech. What was the aha moment that really got you on this pathway?
Well, that's a really good question. The aha moment, not copyrighted at any Scandinavian boy bands who want to now claim that I'm using their branding as part of the conversation, was the very early stages in my career of development with technology was developing remote control technology. The idea of being able to access a device that was somewhere else that avoided you having to get in your Mondeo and drive up the motorway. As simple as. And it started in a very evolutionary way of you needed to have a modem either end and you could sit and listen to it screech for a little bit and then you could have a nice DOS-to-DOS remote control session. I know many at this point watching will say he doesn't look old enough to be playing with DOS, but it's true. The follow-on was in the early 90s was, hang on a second, if you can remote control one screen that is 200 miles away to fix a problem on a remote server or device, wouldn't it be cool if you could control and view 30 screens that were 2 feet away that would allow you to actually supervise, shepherd and nurture learners on devices, give them a steer as to what apps they should and shouldn't be using, allow them, if they, for visibility point of view, to see the teacher's screen presented nice and clearly on their screens. And so the very first iteration was back in 1994 of our classroom management solution. And that was just very simple screen sharing control. The things that teachers and educators wanted, which is typical. Hey, we've got this nice new technology in the classroom. What's your most important feature? How do we make them stop looking and pay attention to me? So blank screen, block of mouse and keyboard, eyes to the front. How do I stop wasting time at the start of the lesson? Automatically open the application on all the student screens. The shepherd and nurtured stuff. Over the years, it's evolved into, well, if they're online with all these different apps, I've got to think about keeping them safe, keeping children safe in education, SEPA in America, whatever your different standards are. And there's also, we've got a really diverse ecosystem of devices now. Over evolution, not all schools have the luxury of having every device matching. Depends on budgets, but some schools is a real mixture of Windows and Chromebooks and Macs and goodness knows what. So just that flexibility to manage the IT estate, because it all comes back down to the same thing. How do we save time? Wasted time when the lesson starts up, wasted time with children not getting on task. And also, I would argue the most important thing is if you want to build people's confidence using technology, education or otherwise, the more consistently it works and does what it says on the tin and people don't have fear of it falling over or not quite doing the things you expected, the more likely they are to build confidence in weaving it. More confidence you have, the more likely you are to develop the ability to innovate and to adapt with it. And that's what we're trying to achieve with technology, is take the basics and allow the educator to run with it and find innovative and fresh new ways to weave it into teaching and learning where appropriate, not always.
I think that happens all the time. We sort of forget the stuff that's so inbuilt and we use every day. And to think that, like I said, it was a revolution. It was a new thing, that everything was always new at some point. And we just take it as given. So the first thing I say to everyone, and it blew my mind, I heard it first from Canva, the most used design software ever is PowerPoint. People still make posters and everything else on PowerPoint, but it's such a given that people don't see it as tech use anymore, and that when people are like, oh, I'm not that tech savvy, I don't use it, this, that, the other, but actually you probably have got a greater skill than you realize. You're just comparing it to the new thing you don't know yet.
Yeah, we often have the Donald Rumsfeld moments. I mean, I think AI sparked that whole conversation again. And, in terms of it's not the known knowns or the known unknowns, it's the unknown unknowns. What is it I don't know about that I could be doing that would save me time or make my life easier? Who's going to tell me and signpost me in the right direction? And then you get that FOMO, well, if other schools are doing something different, does that make me somehow bad at my practice? In the same way as I have CEOs of school clusters ringing me up on the phone and whispering, Al, I've been using Claude and it's really good. I'm like, why are you whispering? Well, it feels like I'm cheating somehow. And it's like, it's your professional judgment going in and it's your professional judgment on the output. It's a tool, nothing more. But I absolutely agree. If you took the magic secret sauce of reinvent the education system where technology is involved, what would it look like? The answer is we wouldn't notice it. It's just part of the toolkit. It just is there to be used when appropriate. It isn't used all the time, and people don't have to think about it in a more, constructive way. It's just interwoven. It's a tool, not the same way as the physical resources are in the classroom. But and I won't go off too much on topic, but it's a topic I wrote about in the book. If I was able to wave my secret sauce and start all over again, if you just picked the globe up and said, I need to deliver education based on geography, you wouldn't start by saying, where do I put all the school buildings? Because in most countries, you wouldn't be able to make them close enough to all the learners. You'd start with, how do I provide a connectivity to all my learners to get a common level of education? And then you'd talk about, how can I bring them together in physical spaces? And so in that sense, technology is both the leveler and it's also the fundamental divider of equity across our school systems now.
Well, you've kind of touched on it there. That's sort of our next question, really, is you've literally written the book on the awkward questions in education. So why do you feel like now was the right time to sort of bring those questions to the fore?
Well, I guess there's two reasons. There's the flippant one, which is, if I don't write it now, I'm going to forget it, because you reach that tipping point in your learning journey. That's my flippant answer. The serious answer is, somebody's got to. There are lots of really good, well-intentioned folks talking about lots of the topics that I've shared. They're not something that magically came to me one night and nobody else has considered them. But I do think we just keep talking about stuff and we don't actually talk about, actually, with these things, is there a next step? Is there some consensus? We assume, there's a lot of assumption. We do this in England, therefore that's the way it happens around the world. But is it? Are there different places and systems doing different things? So what I wanted to do was kind of let people focus one chapter at a time on just one question, bring in the statistics, the data, the evidence, from around the world, the research that links to the current challenge, bring in relevant voices from professionals in different roles in education to supplement that, and then provide those kind of next step questions, the things that we should be thinking about of how we can move the conversation forward and implement change. And my view has always been, again, if you ask the right questions, and empower system leaders with the right questions to discuss amongst themselves, they're probably best placed to fix it. More often than not, our barriers right now are because system leaders aren't in control. We often have, and I see it traveling around the world, in our democracies where we have our electoral cycles, we basically say, don't do any big long-term projects because whoever's in power wants to start and finish within one electoral cycle so they can get the credit for it. So we end up nibbling at the edges. We just polish bits and tweak, but we don't actually rewrite. And then you get other countries where you have a ruling family that have been in power for 100 years. And whilst they may have different challenges in their education system, they can make a decision overnight to say, we want to change something and we want to do something. And everybody's on board and they can deliver change at pace. And then you have some countries where, due to geopolitical challenges, and I'm thinking of Eastern Europe, there's a change in their status from being aligned back to the Soviet Union to being independent, and there becomes a line in sand where they can actually rewrite their curriculum and their educational approach, rewrite and define what they do. And so we see countries like Estonia that often get held up for different reasons. Now, I'm not saying anyone's perfect, and I'm certainly not saying that I have all the answers, but what I can say is you can look, and if you compare across all, you can kind of say, hang on a second, we can't all be right. There has to be differences here. There has to be elements that recognize that if we were bold enough to politically in England or in the UK take a view of saying, let's do a 10 or 15 year education strategy and make it cross-political. Let's agree the funding and who's being empowered to make those decisions. We could shift the dial. Maybe we don't need to do the whole system. I would argue, as I know you folks are very well informed on, that the advent of AI, for me, the conversation isn't so much about AI itself, is that AI has been the catalyst for us to reflect on our curriculum and our system. And most importantly, from my area of personal sort of passion and involvement, has been how it's amplified the skills agenda. I spent 2 years co-chairing a work stream with the OECD, which was focused on their move from their kind of current PISA measures to introducing their evaluation based on human flourishing, and very much sort of taking the context that in addition to those academic 15-year-old summaries and measures that we do, we should also be celebrating the acquisition of skills, those soft skills, critical thinking skills, communication skills, imagination, creativity, resilience, all those things, but also how the education system should support children developing a love of learning, a sense of awe and wonder, something I always like, quite Aristotle based in many of the kind of concepts that they put forward as part of the OECD foundations. And for me, it becomes a trigger, because if we say, and forgive me on my usual rambles, if we kind of say, well, technology is on a marching journey that means some things like maths and adding up big numbers and doing complicated tasks might get done by computers. It says the thing that will be most important is our most human skills. That's what differentiates us from the machine. And that's what employers want, is people with those most human skills. It becomes a domino effect that then says, well, firstly, can we stop measuring academic retention and start measuring acquisition of skills as well within our curriculum frameworks? And then it also says, probably the most important one, given my sort of thoughts about alternative provision, SEND and others, it's changed the goalpost, because it doesn't mean the typical Western mindset of the smartest child, the most academic child, will be most successful in life. And it's something I've shared at a few events. I stumbled across, which is rather ironic given the quote, that a Chinese proverb, a stumbling bird can be first to the forest, which in itself is not the most catchy. But in essence, we have a Western viewpoint that the most able and academic children are likely to be the most successful, acquire the most qualifications, and go on to be amazing in life. In the East, there's more a mindset of actually it's the child that works hardest, has the potential to be most successful. That stumbling bird can still get to the forest first. And I think this concept now is that with the role of technology and skills and human qualities being more prevalent, we've suddenly leveled the playing field, that aspirationally isn't just the most academically able child that can be most in demand in the workplace and most successful in life. If you're listening, at this point here, Aaron and Matt will have cut 25 minutes out of that ramble, and we'll now be episode 412 because I've had to put it to the back of the queue.
No, we won't at all. We'll leave every second of that in, but it kind of leads into this thing of what is a good school. Like, so you've probably touched on about 50 different challenges in there. No. And like I said, it's about asking those questions, having that conversation. But this is something me and Ben built the business on, was that we were sick of having the conversation. What do we do about it? How do we take that action, take that next step? I know it's something on your pod with Matt as well, Jessup, that you talk about, of what are the actions? How can you do it? As he's someone who's a head teacher, he's a decision maker, he's someone who's aware of all of these issues and those problems, and he's someone who's doing something about it. He puts on festivals, he puts on focus weeks where they look at AI and they look at what the creativity around it is, and looks at those soft skills, because they are so important. As someone who's a PE teacher, a DT teacher, I wholeheartedly believe in that it should be problem based. We shouldn't be putting criteria on stuff, and research says it's very difficult to assess that, and it brings up the age-old question of, are we assessing what's important, or are we assessing what we can assess? And I think most of us will agree, when we get into the real world and we're out there, that a lot of what school taught us isn't that relevant or necessary or needed. And have we really changed any of it? Or, like you said, are we just shuffling the furniture on the Titanic? Is that the answer? Because you brought it up there, and I know you've said this in the past about it being political. So is that the answer, that it has to be, to make good schools and give them that freedom, has to be a much longer journey than just 4 years?
It has to be a longer journey, but this is the bit where I can upset folks, and it's not intended, but it's just a bit of a reality check. Another one of my hats, that obviously my foolish things that get me interested, I get involved in because I think I can help support change, is I chair the business boards for the mayoral combined authority, Cambridgeshire and Peterborough. Cambridgeshire, one of the kind of shining lights in UK PLC, and one of the most important bits of data that comes from that is the labour market information report each year, and that basically summarises the skills that the employers that are looking to grow massively across our region, one of the UK's highest growth regions, are looking for, and where there's a deficit. Yeah, we want to grow UK's biotech, sciences, agri-tech, AI stuff, and we're struggling to recruit people with these skills. So we have two choices. We either go abroad and recruit them, or we upskill and we build into our curriculum and we build into our post-16 provision the right qualifications that mean we can fill the void and people who live in our country can actually take on those jobs. Nothing particularly rocket science about that. But at that point, you can pause and say, so I'm sorry to tread on lots of toes, but education system, you don't get to choose. The future workplace says this is the skills we want to grow our economy. Your job is to deliver it. Now, when somebody tells you how to deliver it, you're entitled to go, whoa, whoa, whoa. We know best how to get that child to the point where those skills are acquired, embedded, and they can thrive. But please don't tell us that you know better what skills the child needs than the workplace who's going to be offering them the jobs of the future. And in that sense, the curriculum is absolutely not fit for purpose because it hasn't fundamentally changed. We roll our clock back to the 1800s, the Industrial Revolution, and we look and we say, actually, being very simplistic, we want to make sure anywhere across the Commonwealth, the British Empire, a child can learn the basic numeracy and literacy skills. So when they leave, we can pick them up and drop them in the workplace, and they can be constructive to the Commonwealth. That was the fundamentals. And we've tinkered around the edges and we've added different topics and things in, and I'm exaggerating massively for effect. But our ability to say, hang on a second, there must be a point here where we say this can't be right, needs to be echoed. So part of the journey is, well, why do we have, and again, I appreciate this will be different by regions, why do we have A-levels? Well, they weren't magically thought up. They were crafted and created by universities to give them an admission system that was measurable for them. How do we find a way to allow the threshold, the gate of who comes into the university system? And given we've got an A-level system, we might as well make, as it was originally, an O-level system and now GCSE system, where we'll kind of follow a metric. But just to make sure we plan things right, we'll create a threshold that says no matter how many kids take this qualification, we'll normalize it so at least 40% fail, because that just makes it something we can put into our system to make sure it's got quality control against it. Again, another really simple and strange challenge that I don't agree with. But if we go through those stepping stones, we say, okay, so we do our GCSEs, we do our A-levels, we go off and we do a degree, and then we go into the workplace. We say, well, when we do a degree, we get tested over 3 years. We do written papers we submit and they mark. And at the end of it, we do an exam and they mark. And that carries a bit more marks. But we're happy to be the sum of continual assessment in some shape or form over 3 years. And that's okay for that really important qualification of a degree. In the workplace, we're happy to judge you throughout the year on your performance and your engagement and the tasks that you have set as your areas for development. And we continually assess you and you have an appraisal and we mark it. But for some reason, if we step one bit back from those two most important things, which we're happy to continually assess, when we come to an A-level, we go, no, that doesn't sound right. What we need to do is make you remember it all and give you 2 hours to prove what you know. And that's got to be fair and equitable for everybody, because everybody can perform at the same level under pressure with a piece of paper and a pen in their hand for 2 hours. And nobody sits and says, hang on a second, the world's moved on. How can that be right? And then nobody says, well, if that's the case at GCSE, is one of the challenges why we're having problems getting our learners into the classroom, seeing relevance, seeing fairness, seeing the ability to succeed. We still say, no, but we want you to remember everything and test you over 2 or 3 years at the end with some magic test, and that's enough. For 70% of the kids, they can do it. It works. But for at least 30% of the kids, it sets them up for failure. And surely our system is, how do we find different ways to prove what you know and what you're capable of? But more importantly, how do we set you up to have confidence in what you know and what you're capable of? Not a system that sets you up to say, actually, you're a square peg in a round hole, but sorry, we've done it this way for 150 years, so how dare you challenge it? Well, my answer is, there's a lot of good people far more knowledgeable than me that I know are challenging it. And I just wanted to bring together a lot of voices, a lot of what's happening around the world and say, come on, how daft are we to not embrace this opportunity to really refactor? And we've got reviews out, we've got curriculum reforms out, but honestly, we'll say it and we'll have some good folks sat around the table, but we still start with the same curriculum on the table to start with and say, what do we think we should tweak? It should be, where's the blank sheet of paper and what are we trying to achieve? All the conversations we have in education around EdTech and about digital transformation, we say it's no good just talking about what you're going to do and how you're going to do it, but you've got to start by defining the why. Why are we doing this? Well, surely curriculum design starts with what are we trying to achieve and why are we doing this? Then we can talk about the hows. Then we can use the education expertise to figure out the best way to impart that knowledge and wisdom and confidence with our learners. And somebody will listening in, I'm sure, will be saying, you're not a teacher, Alan, you can't possibly say that. But if you follow that frame, this is about education being the engine room of our future economy and society, and being, in effect, a service department. You've got a demand. We will try and help meet that demand to empower young people to leave education feeling amazing, self-confident and bulletproof, PS, and with the right skills that fit, And so, again, another Al ramble. You probably guess I'm quite passionate about these topics, but it's like, seriously, surely ministers can see it. They just don't choose to act upon it.
It's almost like we picked them on purpose just to get you going. But does it come from? So who is the change maker? I'm going to change my next question. Is it the politicians or is it the teachers themselves? Because I can tell you from my point of view, being a teacher myself, I get told a lot that I'm like two different people. Inside of school, Monday to Thursday, I am that teacher and I have to work within certain limits. Outside of that, I'm completely different. Like I said, I'm a rabble rouser, I'm an anarchist, I want change, I want this, and I want to do it completely different. But then I have to step back into that system at times. And then I work with teachers that they're not operating at that level. They've not questioned the why. They don't, because they're very protective of their profession, their expertise. And I am forever fighting fear and ego. So is it the masses that have to club together to force that change, or does it need to come top down?
It would be lovely if it was a simple one or t'other, and it's not a zero-sum game. The truth is, it is a bit of both. Fear of change, and particularly fear of change in a time when you're at capacity and under pressure for different reasons, is an entirely natural persuasion, and it's something that happens across all sectors. It's not edu-specific. So I think sometimes when we talk about fear of change, there's a natural assumption that we're casting some kind of judgment or criticism, which in this context would be entirely inappropriate. There's not a criticism there. But we also know, and we've seen, that there is a whole heap of ways that we can, within our schools, work more effectively, change our practice. We see, as you talked about, with the advent of new digital tools, we've got to reconsider the way that we assess. It's not a surprise that you see more project problem-based learning being featured more prevalently, because we're just trying to find different ways for students to find relevance in tasks and link into it, but also different ways to assess understanding. It's not surprising that we see from the primary level up, more conversations around universal design for learning and flexibility around that. We see learners younger and younger building up the confidence in the digital citizenship of using devices to prepare them for an earlier digital journey, again, which is really important. So I think there's lots we can do within our schools, but there's a limit, isn't there? I mean, there's innovation and there's trying to shift the dial. And I think schools are constantly trying to do that whilst fighting the what's currently on my priority list. My priority is I want to change the way we do these things, but actually today my problem is recruitment and retention, attendance, getting kids across to school, social, emotional, mental health challenges, behaviour control. It keeps sitting there at number 5, but I just can't get it up the list because of other firefighting. We kind of get that. There's a second part is thinking about system-wide change, but then being realistic that we can't say, could you just sign off on 15 years? But actually breaking that down into chunks that allow ministers and civil servants sitting behind them, which often are the continuity of the same messaging, whether it's positive or negative, to say there's this first chunk is something that you could do. There's a potential where you can get some early wins and feedback from it, but it's the foundation to step 2, to step 3, to step 4. I think this ties in with the fact that what we're going to see is we're going to see breakaways. We're going to see people coming up with their own curriculum pathways. I was on a chat with Matt Jessup. We were interviewing last week or a few weeks ago. At some point, we're going to recognise that credential-wise and qualification-wise, micro-credentials will become more prevalent. They are in the workplace. I mean, we all learn and go and do a course. We spend 6 weeks online and we do something. We get a certificate and it says, "Al, congratulations, you're now a level 1 numpty at Power BI or whatever," and you go, "I got my certificate," But why can't our learners with different skills acquire those micro credentials? But at what point do we find that, as the example was in our podcast conversation, Amazon bring out their own qualifications and courses for education covering all the different pathways and strands, and suddenly find that schools say, "You know what? I'm going to follow their structure, and I'm going to follow that route there. And we find that in this journey towards a more likely blended virtual education system, there'll be more nuance. You know, we've got the early signs of some of the independent schools breaking away from the standard curriculum and using that autonomy they've got slightly more of to be independent. I think our double-edged sword in education is always we want to do things that are evidence-informed. We don't want our kids to be the experiment that may fail, may succeed, and it impacts them on their life journey. But sometimes change is such that you're not going to have the luxury of evidence before you make the change. You've got to be the ones that innovate at the front of the curve. And then it's how do we cycle that back so we're not all making the same mistakes. We can all learn from the positives and take that forward, which again comes full circle to you asked me the question, what is a good school? When you meet me in the street and say, Al, tell me about your schools in Peterborough, do I say to you, let me tell you about my GCSE outcomes and my SAT scores in my primary schools? Or do I say we're a community ethos school where children are valued? We've got some really innovative stuff. We've got some amazing kids. We chose to do a shared sixth form, so we've got a broader offer of curriculum courses for our learners, and we've got a really good retention rate. You know, and by the way, we've also got fantastic attendance, but we know we can do more. But we just got the most amazing teachers, and it's a lovely space. I'd love you to come and see and get the sense of community that we have. Oh, P.S. Yes, on our SATs we got this percentage, and yes, our phonics is on the way up. But in the scheme of things, that's not what we all hold dear. And it's not to mitigate that those numbers and those league tables aren't important, but actually they're less and less important to employers and to the people working in the education system. We're actually looking about trying to make our kids resilient and robust and empowered for the future workplace. And I know a lot of us, I certainly will in my trust, chair in our trust, I'll take a couple of hits on the league table in return for having a broader set of curriculum resource subjects available to the kids. You know, that sometimes you have to kind of be pragmatic and say, I know the system says this is how we measure a good school because an inspector tells us, but actually it's a country mile away from how we within our schools measure our schools being good, the things that make us proud.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's always the first thing they want to come and take pictures of is PE, DT, arts, drama. Put it all over the website, all on the prospectus. But is that value there? Is it not? Is that the focus? And I say it all the time, COVID, people weren't screaming, give me back the maths. We wanted to go out and play and create and make and so on. So yeah, how it hasn't come through, we don't know.
I don't want to diminish any subjects because in my eyes they're all equal for different reasons, and I absolutely agree with the breadth of subjects being really important. But I have a hunch as the years go by, advanced mathematical skills will probably get nibbled away by technology far quicker than our creative, artistic skills and our interpersonal skills. So what we might find is the typical guaranteed buckets in an EBAC, for example, get switched to be actually those other ones that have often been number 2, number 3 on the choices list start to elevate. Not that we'll ever want to, I hope, lose numeracy and literacy, but at some point we'll say, based on technology, we might just put matrices and log tables to one side and talk about APRs and interest rates on finance and mortgages and other things that are slightly more relevant.
I'm going to jump in and ask my AI question. Well, I'm changing it because you answered the AI question earlier, which was about text for tech's sake and what do you think that's going to be? But based on what you've just said about capacity and good school, based on like what we're hearing in the news, and you know that like political pressure will probably trickle into the UK because China's announced having AI in the curriculum. It's not as much as you'd think, but 8 hours a year, which isn't a lot. Trump's probably going to sign an executive order. It's probably
he will.
I've just jumped on BBC News to see if he's done it about making AI literacy a mandatory thing in schools, which I'm all for and behind. But what's going to give for that? Because you've still got to get through the curriculum for DT, art, drama, music, maths, English. Where's that gonna give, or where do you think that might give? Based on what you know about the current experience, if you've got head teachers whispering down the phone about AI, what's the typical classroom teacher going to be able to get up there and go like, hey, year 3, let's pick AI today?
But there's a stepping stone journey here, isn't there? I mean, we talk about AI in education, and the natural conversation is about how it's being woven into teaching and learning. The truth is, in most schools, AI starts with how's it woven into teaching capacity, resource making, reporting, analytics, and then you get the non-generative stuff that sits there as personalized learning pathways and tools that sit there for children. And then down the line, we start to build confidence and we see it beginning to be used within the teaching and learning space. The conversation around curriculum is, my view absolutely has been for quite some time, is that we are too content heavy and not enough skills. Now, I do believe you need skills and you need content and context to develop agency. So it's not a case of one or the other. You would argue, certainly when it comes to, Matt Jessup, as somebody referenced, is a really good example of that. At primary space, we could probably cut back a third of the curriculum to make more space for fluid, place and space-based related learning. So depending on where the children are from and their context and the space you're in, different resources are available. There's different ways to learn. I think at secondary, you have to look and say, actually for a while now, there's been, certainly in the state system, there's been a very subtle but definite narrowing of the curriculum offer. That's based on the funding model as much as anything else. And so you can widen that model by giving people more choices. It starts with things like not having compulsory EBAC, because I think that's a false one. I mean, basically, if a child isn't good at MFL, they're kind of not going to get an EBAC. Why would you put somebody in for something they're going to fail? It just seems a daft criteria and measurement anyway. And then I think you have to look and say, well, actually, maybe the amount of time we spend on this is going to shock a few people and upset them. Maybe we spend too much time on numeracy and literacy. Maybe actually there's about breadth of stuff. I would argue a bit less numeracy and a bit more digital skills would probably be much more appropriate for the workplace of the future. Maybe if we changed the way we assessed, so we were able to assess as we went along, we wouldn't spend and waste so much of our time having to revisit and do exam prep and revisions and other things that could be spent more time teaching. Certainly in year 6 and in year 2, the amount of time that gets spent on preps for SATs and phonics that could have been spent on just crack on and keep going if we were doing slightly less, high stakes testing at different points, there'd be an argument that actually that in itself would free up quite a bit of time. I think the question is being bold. What are we trying to achieve? It comes full circle, and again, it's not dismissing any of the languages. It's giving any of the subjects. It's giving learners the choice and the pathways. But the world's changing. We had the same conversation, for goodness sake, when calculators came in and people were like, oh, we can't have a calculator in the classroom. We're going to stop. Children are going to stop learning how to add up. Well, surprising that didn't happen, and it's the same again. And now we have the conversation with AI. It will stop kids thinking, and we've got to be really careful of bias and all the rest of it. Well, for a start, nobody said stop using Google because the algorithm's not particularly clear. And actually the order that results get returned isn't as what you think, but is based on lots of different factors that then requires our judgment as, are they top because they spent the most money, or are they top because they're the most relevant? But actually critical thinking and those other bits, for me, add value to all of the other subjects. If you change that focus on assessment to getting kids thinking about output and real resources and sources from lots of different things, potentially there's different ways we can do it. So I don't know if that really answers your question. I would shave it off some of the priorities and provide space for context-based topics and subjects that are most relevant to cohorts. A few years ago, I remember doing an event, and someone was talking about there were a primary school in Sunderland where basically all the kids went to the secondary school up the road, and from there they all went into the Nissan car plant in Sunderland, and pretty much that was their flow. So at some point they recognised that actually they needed to change the skills that they were offering the children at secondary school, because there were new jobs for programming the robots and the computers in the factory and for doing more of the design and manufacturing bits. So they adapted their program. Well, that geographical limitation in many regards is gone now, because you can sit at home and you can work for a company in Silicon Valley or anywhere else, and that hopefully means with the right equity of connectivity, our children can the opportunities are unlimited to them. So why are we restrictive on their curriculum choices just because we think the best thing for them to do is to have advanced mathematical skills rather than digital skills or extra critical thinking skills or design skills or something else that's more relevant?
I think we've got quite an agreement.
Yeah,
For a
I mean,
moment.
there's a lot to unpick. I mean, this is my obvious plug, which is read the book, because there's loads of other perspectives of other people that I really value that share their views. And it's just chapter one, which is what is a good school. We've got 8 other subjects to dive into.
Well, I'm going to
After that.
quickly dip
So we
into
can
one,
help
hopefully.
people on that journey, you know.
Just dipping into one about inclusivity. And again, I was a student, went through the whole system, got diagnosed with Ascend issue 21, I think. I went to university a little bit later, faffed around, did some gap year stuff. And yeah, so why did it get its own chapter? And what do you think schools need to hear a little bit more about inclusivity?
Well, I mean, inclusivity is a whole heap of one. I mean, partly it's included because I love learning, and I have a role, but I also can see that this is an ever-moving feast. Because when we talk about inclusivity, I suppose the first thing is it forces us to think about are the spaces we create for learning actually the right spaces for all our learners? For some, are they intimidating spaces? Are there for some other ways that a free flow environment, the way that children enter and engage in education and learning could be different? There's a sense of whether the offer is something that's relevant to those learners, whether they feel it's something they understand they have engagement purpose with. Is it suitable and equitable for them to do? There's a sense just in the broader sense of what is it we're trying to do in our schools. And we have a major challenge right now. We see post-pandemic a real challenge with attendance. And yes, some of that maybe gets anecdotally pushed to one side to say, well, parents are working at home, so they've got more flexibility, so they like to keep their kids at home. Well, maybe, but there's also an element that there's a growing cohort of children that just don't find the school experience inclusive. They don't find it a place that they either resonate with, whether it's from anxiety, a safe space, or whether the way that our curriculum and our learning is delivered is inclusive and suits for them. You know, we can go from the very simple bit of thinking about some of our SEN children and teacher making sure that everyone's eyes front of the class and looking at me. Well, that isn't going to work for some children and learners in their learner style. Didn't work when we had to expect them to all be on screen and on camera during the pandemic either. But we also recognise that we all learn in different ways. No, I'm not going to go back and say, yes, it's all about that stuff that's been debunked about kinesthetic learning and other bits. But there's still that argument that says, actually, we keep talking about education's not one size fits all. And yet we then say for our learners in our school, in wherever we are, yes, it is. You're all going to fit into this mould. You're all going to learn at the same pace and you're all going to be judged in the same way. Well, stop it. We need to be more creative than that. Now, of course, we don't have magic wands, and the best intentioned educators are going to say, well, are you going to come and build us a different school now with a different layout, or are you going to try something? And the answer is, well, no, but we have to identify what does and doesn't work so that we can then inform the design of future schools. In the short term, we have to look about how we can use spaces differently. Maybe we have to say, and I'm thinking with my pupil referral unit hat on, maybe we have to recognise that a part-time timetable isn't such a bad thing, but maybe part-time timetable means part-time in school and part-time at home and accessing learning in different ways. Does technology now unlock that? Do we have a better way to provide more of that emotional support for our SEN learners digitally than perhaps we could before? Are we better skilled? Is it our course provision? Is it just tying in that sense of youngsters increasingly now want to see a purpose, a relevance, a point to what they're learning? That, I think, ties in with project-based learning and other bits, problem-based learning. But where's the relevance in what I'm doing? Is it a surprise that esports and other things have grown in popularity? Now, I think like apprenticeships, parents are the ones that are quick to dismiss. Don't do an apprenticeship. That's a bad career move. Well, actually, apprenticeships now can be everything from AI, design, gaming, through to plumbers and electricians, and frankly, all of them are highly paid and highly skilled roles nowadays. But we have an old mindset of you're going to be a builder or a carpenter. And in the same ways, we look at esports and say, sort of, what, my child's going to spend 2 years just playing games, not thinking around the whole broader sense of what it is. But if a child sees as a purpose and an interest, I think there's a much better chance of success. And it's therefore not a surprise that when children choose their GCSE choices, often the subjects that weren't available up until that point become quite popular, the sociology, psychologies and other subjects, because they just want to do something different. They aren't engaged and enthralled with what they're currently learning. Surely we can figure that out.
I think it's that modern look on things, isn't it? Of how do you look at all that aspect without that understanding of that a influencer is a job now and is a very important part of marketing. Actually, you'd be more inclined to go off and send your child on that esports course when you said, well, actually, no, I'm going to go and be an esports psychologist, and we're going to talk about stress and motivation and what that does for it as a sport, because that's kind of where it's going and heading for a multi-billion-dollar industry across the world. You start talking about it more seriously like that, it becomes much more than gaming and building games and designing and so on. Oh, there's so many aspects to it, but without that understanding, you don't necessarily know what you're guiding them towards or pushing them towards.
I think there's a real challenge here because nobody has the perfect answer. But, we kind of start for the first year in education where it's often student-led learning, free flow, often between classrooms where the kids are exploring and developing those kind of core foundational skills. And then we kind of get everybody in their rows on the carpet or at their tables learning. And at some point, we think the best way is for you to sit there and engage, and we're going to give you 5 hours worth of information. And we tried to do it in the pandemic. And the irony is we often end up doing CPD and professional development as adults, and we sit down in those situations where we've got really informative people whose specialism is sharing and imparting wisdom in an informative and engaging way. And you sit there and think 4 or 5 hours of it, and dear God, it doesn't matter how amazing they are. My, whatever it is, my Eppinghauser's forgetting curve, and someone will correct me on my wrong terminology for it. But, it's like, why would we assume that that's the optimum model for learning and engagement? And I know many educators will say, well, it isn't, and I do lots of different things to make sure that's not the case. But that is the foundation of how we try and cram these things in and deliver the day. And of course, there's limitations. It's teaching resources, timetabling. It's a requirement to deliver certain elements of the curriculum. And there's only so many ways we can educate 20 or 30 children simultaneously, unless you want to fund us to have, 5 children per child. But that doesn't mean just because we've always done it that way, we shouldn't constantly be challenging and saying, isn't now the time that maybe for some subjects, for some approaches, we could redefine this, we could think about different ways. How do we know until we don't try? When we decide to build the next schools, why are we going to build them exactly the same, other than with different shiny windows as the last ones? Are we not going to take that opportunity each time to refine and iterate, much as we do with AI, to try and improve that design, try and improve that offer, to give more fluidity to the places and spaces within the school setting?
I completely agree. So let's sort of wrap this up then. Moving forward, say 10 years, what would you hope all the awkward questions would have gained, improved, changed?
Oh, well, I'm a realist as well as being at times a grumpy old git and at times a pragmatist. I think the point is this isn't about somebody coming in or anybody as a system coming in on a white horse and fixing it. This is empowering good people who are already on the system. For all those listening, Ferdinand sends his best wishes. There's somebody at the door.
That'll be Ferdy.
Yeah. This is very much about empowering good people, system leaders around the world to be able to challenge the norm and actually take the conversation forward. I hope there'll be brave politicians around the world that will embrace the opportunity, not what I'm saying, because lots of people have said this before, but will actually be bold enough to actually start to introduce change. I suspect it will be change that will happen, but the catalyst will be the wrong reason. AI is proving a great example of that. We see what's happening in North America. It becomes part of the curriculum. Oh, fear factor, China are doing it. Oh, we'll do it in the UK. And at some point, someone will say, oh, well, great, you're introducing it into the curriculum. What's that going to look like? Oh, we'll worry about that later. But for now, we've got the political headlines. Yes, AI is going to be standardized. Well, I often see people talking about AI and they're talking about the tools. Well, it's not, to me, about the tools. It's about the skills. The more we acquire the skills, it doesn't really matter what tool it is, because frankly, the tool will be different next year and the year after and the year after that. It's about confidence with those core skills, those, how to use the tools, how to ask the right questions, how to challenge the authenticity. And now more of an ever, the list goes on, as well as the bits, including the fab stuff Matthew's done on governance and checking that kind of structures in schools with the use of AI. But I think it will happen because people are trying to keep up with other education systems around the world, rather than because they really want to do it for the right reasons. But we can take that as a win on the side. Sadly, I get invited to most schools or most systems where they've got challenges. But actually, what I see in places that are challenges, often financial or structural, is the most amazing stuff happening in spite of the system, in spite of the limitations. And I think one thing that is consistently shown across education is that actually educators are a stubborn and resilient bunch in a good way. And in spite of the barriers government and politics and funding puts in place, they'll find a way. We can just try and help bring our collective positions together and accelerate that a little bit.
Amazing. I think we're going to hand over our last question to
I just disconnected, I think, from
Matt, who I hope is still there. Is he
Matt's there,
am I here?
Can't hear you, Matt.
Oh, he's back. We're back.
I think. Am
We
I
almost
back?
went a whole episode with no hiccup then as well.
You are back, yeah.
I just disappeared for a while. Shall I jump in with the last question, or did you? I'm not sure where you're at. You might have covered your second question.
Yeah, no, please do.
Now, am I still here? Am I floating in the ether?
Yeah, no. We're ready for you. We almost had the illusion of professionalism there, so we're doing all right.
Almost. We'll get there one day.
So I'm going to jump in, and I'm going to give you our last one because I think Matt's dipped out again. Is there any question that you haven't been asked in an interview? You are a man who's very popular, very sought after, and what would that question be?
Oh my goodness, yeah, I could have got a bit of a heads up on that one. That's a really interesting one. I get asked a lot of questions. I think, yeah, a challenging question that people don't ask me. I think sometimes is in the less flippant sense is the why. Why are you so passionate about this space? Why are you focused on this? My pathway isn't coming through becoming my PGCE and becoming a practitioner in education. For me, there's much more about equity and fairness in society. And education is a real amplifier of seeing that sense of shouldn't all children, wherever they are, get an equal access to a future? And shouldn't that future be limited by their ability and desire, not by the system or by government or by policy? So for me, that's kind of the one that I think people need to recognize that, you don't have to be in the heart of something at the start to make a difference. And we all suffer with imposter syndrome in the bigger picture. How could my little old voice make a difference? How could your little old voice make a difference? But it is about the collegiate nature of we come together, we share a common view, and if enough people come together, share insights, share ideas, or as I've tried to do in the book, do a load of the legwork for people and bring that stuff together, then maybe we inch a little bit closer. But also it just somehow feels a bit easier dealing with challenges when you're not alone, you're dealing with it together.
That's the great question, and I think that's why you can keep going back and back on the why, can't you? Of why do you make that decision, why that tool, why that digital strategy, and so on, and why. And I think everyone has that because teaching is a profession, and it was taught to me as being a calling. But like I said, I don't think it was ever a calling to me to do it as a career, but I think I found that calling within it once I was in there, and you just sort of stumbled across it. But yeah, fantastic deep question to finish on there, Al. I would have gone with your newsletter about how you did it weekly, so yeah, way better than the questions I would have come up with.
A lot of people ask me some really technical questions about how I do my newsletter, and the answer probably surprises most people. I just see cool resources and I email them to myself. And on a Saturday morning, I've got an inbox of 100 emails to myself, and about half of those, when I've read them, go into my newsletter. It's as simple as that. But it's a win-win because it's my CPD. It's my time each week to read and learn, keeps me current, and also reminds me just how many amazing folks across education are sharing cool resources.
And because of you, I don't have to do that. I just read yours every week, and so should everyone else, as well as your book when they can get it ordered. Where can they get it ordered from? Amazon and all good retailers?
It's available. If I age myself, it's even available in Woolworths, which doesn't exist anymore. But yeah, Amazon and all good bookstores. Hopefully, it's a really good read. If at the very least, it signposts a lot of amazing folks in education and some great resources. But this is one I've I spent a good year researching and doing this one. So whatever anybody else thinks, I'm super proud of it. And that's kind of the most important thing sometimes.
Absolutely. Right. Well, it is a goodbye from me and a goodbye from Matt. He did an early departure because of connectivity issues. But otherwise, Al, genuinely, thank you so much for your time. It's been a real pleasure, a real eye-opener talking to you. And I know people would have got a lot of questions from this. Probably not so many answers, but definitely something to go away and think about. So thank you so much for your time. And
My absolute pleasure.
We'll see you next time. Thank you, everyone.